Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I'm so thrilled to have you here for this cinematic deep dive into the biological life cycle of our skeletal system. We usually think of our skeletons as this rigid, permanent scaffolding, right? But the biological reality is infinitely more dynamic than that. Today, we're going to explore exactly why our bone density changes as we age, and we'll break down the incredible science behind how our bodies build, maintain, and eventually lose bone mass.
I want you to listen to this quote. Your bones may look solid and permanent, but inside your body, they are constantly being broken down and rebuilt. So, what happens to this process as we grow older? That question right there is exactly what we are going to answer today, as we uncover the fascinating, completely hidden world of your own living skeleton.
All right, let's jump right in. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, the living bone cycle. Then, aging in bone structure, followed by menopause and accelerated loss. After that, measuring your bone density, and finally, protecting your bone health. Chapter 1, the living bone cycle. Let's talk about how bones actually grow.
To understand why our bones change as we get older, we really have to rewind back to the very beginning. From the absolute moment you're born, your bones are on this incredible trajectory of rapid growth. During childhood and straight through adolescence, your skeletal system is intensely active. It's building bone way faster than it breaks it down, which means your bones are growing rapidly, not just in physical size, but in pure density. This is a super critical window of development that literally builds the foundational strength you're going to rely on for the rest of your life. And this rapid growth phase, it keeps going right through your late teens and into your early 20s.
All of that rapid building eventually gets us to a massive biological milestone called peak bone mass. Basically, think of peak bone mass as your maximum skeletal density. You generally hit this peak in early adulthood. It is essentially your skeletal bank account. The higher your peak bone mass is when you hit your 20s, the more bone you have in reserve and the better protected you are as you inevitably start drawing from that account later in life.
Now here's the really wild part. Even after you reach that peak, your bones don't just sit there. They undergo this continuous, lifelong process called remodeling. Healthy bone is literally living tissue. Older, weakened bone is constantly getting cleared out and completely replaced by fresh new bone. In a healthy young adult, this perfect remodeling cycle of breaking down and building up is tightly coupled together. It keeps your skeleton incredibly strong and resilient without you ever even noticing it's happening.
Chapter 2, aging and bone structure. This is where that perfect equilibrium starts to shift. So as we age, that beautifully synchronized remodeling cycle kinda starts to glitch. The body begins breaking down old bone just a little bit faster than it can build the new stuff. Imagine the inside of your bone is like a honeycomb. As the years go by, the solid bone forming the walls of that honeycomb starts to get thinner, and the empty spaces between those walls grow wider. Even the hard outer shell of the bone thins out. Plus, our bones begin accumulating all these tiny microfractures, and the minerals aren't deposited as evenly anymore. The overall net result? A real structural loss of bone tissue and overall strength. And it's not just physical wear and tear either. There are deep metabolic and hormonal shifts happening behind the scenes. The clinical data shows that aging actively disrupts how our bodies handle calcium and vitamin D, which are absolutely crucial for your skeleton's natural balance. Specifically, as we get older, our levels of parathyroid hormone increase, while the production of the most active metabolites of vitamin D3 actually decreases. These hormonal changes seriously impair the body's ability to maintain that perfect bone remodeling cycle we talked about earlier.
Chapter 3, Menopause and Accelerated Loss. Let's look at accelerated density loss. This brings us to a major biological turning point that dramatically impacts half the population. Look, both men and women lose bone as they get older, but the rate of loss isn't identical. For women going through menopause, which is usually around age 50, estrogen levels just plummet. Since estrogen is highly protective of your bone tissue, losing it triggers a phase of really rapid, accelerated bone mass loss that lasts for several years. Eventually, that rapid loss slows down, and by the time men and women hit 65 or 70, they're generally losing bone at about the same rate again.
If that bone breakdown process significantly outpaces the formation side for a prolonged period, it can lead to osteoporosis. You've probably heard osteoporosis called a silent disease, right? That's because you honestly don't feel it happening. There are rarely any symptoms at all until a bone actually snaps. In serious cases, the bones become so fragile that fractures can happen spontaneously from totally normal stresses. Bending over, lifting something light, a minor bump, a fall from a standing position, or, no joke, even just coughing.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that we have to distinguish between normal aging and osteoporosis. It is perfectly normal to experience some slight age-related mineral loss as those honeycomb walls thin out over the decades. But osteoporosis? That represents a dangerous, accelerated structural collapse. It is a severe uncoupling of the cell populations, where bone mass drops so drastically that the fundamental architecture of the bone caves in. That's what leads to spinal deformities, loss of height, and devastating fractures.
Chapter 4. Measuring your bone density. The clinical assessments.
So you're probably wondering, how do we actually know if we have healthy bones, normal aging, or full-blown osteoporosis? Well, modern medicine is amazing. We can look inside the body and precisely measure this mineral loss using a test called a DEXA, or DEXA scan. That stands for Dual Energy X-ray Absorptiometry. It's this super quick, painless test that uses a very low dose of radiation to measure exactly how much calcium and other minerals are packed into specific areas of your bone. Because the hip and the spine are the weak points most prone to those really dangerous fractures, a central DEXA scan targets those exact areas. When you get that scan, your results come back as a T-score. Basically, a T-score compares your current bone density directly to that ideal peak bone mass of a healthy young adult. If your T-score is -1 or higher, you're good. Your bones are considered healthy. If it dips between -1 and -2.5, you have osteopenia. That's low bone density but not quite osteoporosis. But if that score hits -2.5 or lower, that indicates clinical osteoporosis. And get this staggering fact, your risk of a broken bone increases by 1.5 to 2 times with every single 1-point drop in that T-score. When we zoom out and look at the population level, the variance in fracture risk is pretty stark. Because women generally start with a lower peak bone mass, have smaller bones, and go through that accelerated menopause loss, roughly 1 in 5 women over the age of 50 will develop osteoporosis. For men over 50, that number is 1 in 20. But guys, please don't tune this out. While women are at a much higher statistical risk, older men are absolutely still vulnerable, especially after age 70, and you definitely shouldn't ignore your bone health.
Beyond just age and biological sex, why does bone density vary so wildly from person to person? Well, it comes down to a really complex mix of individual factors. Genetics play a huge role. If your parents had hip fractures, your risk shoots up. Body size matters too. Slender individuals just have less bone to lose. Then there's lifestyle. Being inactive, heavy drinking, and smoking all accelerate bone loss. And finally, certain conditions like gastrointestinal diseases or rheumatoid arthritis, as well as the long-term use of medications like corticosteroids, can seriously drain that bone bank account.
Chapter 5. Protecting your bone health. How to forge stronger bones.
Okay, let's pivot away from the risks and focus on empowerment. Because it is never too early and never too late to forge stronger bones for your future. First and foremost, you have to give your body the raw materials it actually needs to build bone. A lifelong diet packed with essential nutrients is just non-negotiable. You need calcium to build the bone matrix, vitamin D so your body can actually absorb that calcium, and plenty of protein to support the whole bone muscle system. Low-fat dairy, leafy greens, fish, and fortified foods are all phenomenal tools for your daily routine. And the second half of this prevention equation is just as crucial: physical activity. See, bone tissue is incredibly responsive to mechanical loading. To force your bones to adapt and get denser, you really need 3 types of exercise. Number 1 is weight-bearing, things like brisk walking or tennis that force you to work against gravity. Number 2 is resistance training, like lifting weights, which literally pulls on the bones and signals them to bulk up. And number 3 is balance training. Doing things like Tai Chi is absolutely vital as we age, because better balance prevents the falls that cause these devastating fractures in the first place. Ultimately, keeping up with your nutrition and exercise isn't just about avoiding a heavy plaster cast. Protecting your bone health is literally about preserving your fundamental quality of life. When older adults suffer severe hip or spine fractures from osteoporosis, they often face chronic pain and a really difficult recovery. By taking your bone health seriously right now, you are actively preserving your long-life mobility, your safety, and your absolute independence as you age. We've seen how our living skeleton builds itself up, how aging and hormones naturally break it down, and exactly what we can do to fight back. Which leaves me with one final question for you. Will you start investing in your bone bank today to build a stronger tomorrow? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really encourage you to chat with your doctor about your bone health and see if a DXA scan makes sense for you. Stay healthy, stay active, and take care of your skeleton.